text for our sermon this morning is our Old Testament reading from Esther chapter 4. Listen again to these words from that reading. Mordecai said, "If you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this?" Please pray with me. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord. Amen. You may be seated. Dear brothers and sisters in Christ, Esther stood underneath a majestic stone archway, splendid in the royal robes draped gracefully around her. She was beautiful. The soft features of her face composed into an expression serene and humble. On the outside, she was serene. On the inside, her heart was pounding away in anxious rhythm. Will I live? Will I die? Will I live? Will I die? Her breath caught in her throat as King Xerxes' eyes located her there, standing just one step outside the king's hall. Her eyes locked onto the scepter in her husband's hand, that gold scepter, watching for the movement that would mean her life or the stillness that would mean her death. The moment stretched, and as her fear grew, the words of her cousin echoed in her memory. Who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this? Such a time as this. It was a time that would have been unimaginable 10 years before. 10 years ago, Esther had just been one more Jew, one more exile in a city filled with foreigners and filled with exiles, the capital city of an empire that stretched from Egypt all the way to India. At that time, her place had been occupied by another, by Queen Vashti, a worthy woman, a strong woman, a woman bold and proud. King Xerxes wasn't a hard man to understand. He may have been the king, but he was simple, really. He loved feasts, he loved luxury, he loved wealth, and he loved showing it all off. He decreed that for 180 days, for a full 6 months, he would do nothing but exhibit the treasures of his kingdom, and he put them all on display for all to see. And at the end of those 6 months, then he had a feast, 7 days long. Every man in the citadel was invited, and it was all you could eat, it was all you could drink, and it was all at the king's expense. And so after 6 months of showing off his wealth, and after 7 days of showing off his generosity, he had just one treasure left to exhibit. Vashti, the queen. Vashti the beautiful, the proud, the strong, and the bold. He sent his messengers, and they arrived in the room where Queen Vashti was holding a banquet for the women of the citadel. The king requests your presence, wearing your royal crown, at his banquet. And Queen Vashti lifted her eyes to those messengers, and then stretching out her beautiful neck, she did the unthinkable. She shook her head. No. Too proud to be a trophy, too strong to be coerced, too bold to be cowed by the command of the king. She said no to the king in full view of the citadel. It may just have been a pebble rolling down the hillside, but it became an avalanche of events that changed the course of history. The king was furious. And Vashti the bold, Vashti the proud, Vashti the beautiful, Vashti was exiled. She would never again see the king's face. And her place would be given to another, to someone more to the king's liking, to someone who was beautiful, yes, but bold, proud, strong. Let's just say he didn't want another Vashti. King Xerxes was a simple man, really. And so there was just going to be one criteria. Family didn't matter. Connections, your origin, your status, none of that played into account. The only thing that mattered was one simple criteria. Find a queen who would please the king. The loveliest ladies from the entire empire were sent to the capital city. 127 provinces contributed the loveliest young women of their nation. And in that mass of young women, there was a Jew named Hadassah, but called Esther. Esther caught the eye of the king's servant in charge of all these young ladies. And as they all underwent the year of beauty preparation required before the king would even be allowed to set his eyes on them, that servant favored Esther. Maybe it was her beauty, maybe it was her kindness, maybe it was her humility, or maybe we should just sum it up as God's will. But one way or another, as all of those women were undergoing the preparation, Esther found herself receiving the best food, the best treatments, the best possible preparation. Remember, King Xerxes was a simple man with a simple criteria. And so at the end of that year of preparation, each of those young ladies would have their moment with the king to be judged by that one all-important criteria. Did he delight in her? Did she please him? When Esther stood there underneath that stone archway, her life hanging in the balance, her mind jumped back to that first moment when she had seen the king. The year of preparation behind her, summoned into the king's presence. The pounding of her heart then hadn't been so different from the pounding of her heart now. She could still smell the scent of the perfumes recommended by that kind servant of the king who had favored her. She could still feel the tingle of the most powerful human hand in the world touching her arm. Every piece of advice that that servant of the king had given her, she had taken, and wisely so. Because when the competition was over, there was one name the king remembered. There was one face etched into his memory. Esther. And she was queen. What a life she had had. Even if it would all end on this day, what a life. From an orphan, scooped up by the kind and wise cousin named Mordecai, to this. Consort to the king. Not just the king, the emperor, the most powerful man, the wealthiest man the world over. Esther had woken up that morning on the softest bed the world had to offer. Her bedroom held riches worth more than many kingdoms. Her wardrobe was limitless. Servants arrived at the snap of her fingers. No one cared that she was a Jew. No one even knew that she was a Jew. It was all hers. The world was hers, and it would always be hers as long as she refused to make the mistake that Vashti had made. Not too bold. Not too strong. The world was hers. But her cousin Mordecai, the one who had taken her in, who had raised her as his own, he was strong. Maybe even too strong, it would seem to some. The first time Esther heard the name Haman, it meant nothing to her, just another noble, just another advisor to the king. But soon it became clear that Haman wasn't just another noble, he was the noble. He, more than any other in the kingdom, knew the way to the king's favor, and he won that favor again and again and again until he became second in command over that entire empire. And Haman was a proud man. He loved the adoration, the adulation that he received because of his connection with the king. He loved to parade the streets and watch as the people bowed down to him, as one and all they went on their knees before him, one and almost all, one and not quite all, one and all except Mordecai. In some ways, Esther is a strange book. Never mentions God. Not once. In 10 chapters, it never mentions God. Maybe it's a reflection of how God's people felt about God in that time of exile, like he was far away. But it's only by reading between the lines that we can see God at work in these events. He's never mentioned. And so it's only by reading between the lines that we can guess why it is that Mordecai wouldn't bend his knee before Haman. Perhaps it was in obedience to God's command, worship the Lord your God and serve him only. Regardless of the reason, it made Haman furious. The second most powerful man in the kingdom couldn't stand it. And every time he saw Mordecai refusing to bow before him, he was filled with a murderous rage, with a hatred that went beyond murder. In fact, murder wouldn't even satisfy it. Nothing short of genocide would satisfy Haman. No one knew Mordecai's connection with the queen. To Haman's eyes, he was just one more Jew, one more obstinate Jew. One more problem. Now, no one understood the king better than Haman, and so Haman no doubt waited for just the opportune moment before he brought this problem to the king's attention. Maybe it was over a meal, as the conversation idly bounced between business and pleasure. And Haman picked up a grape from the table, and rolling that grape between his fingers, he broached the subject. "O king, there's a people in your empire, scattered through all the provinces. And the truth is, they're a problem. They don't obey the king's laws, and it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Then he put that grape in his mouth and began to chew as he let King Xerxes digest his words. He recognized just the mood he was looking for in the king: agreeable, not too inquisitive, not too interested in the affairs of state at the moment, more interested in the food laid out in front of them. And so then, before the king could ask who this people was or what commands it was that they refused to obey, Haman continued with the rest of his plan. If it pleases the king, he should issue a decree to destroy this people. And out of my love for the kingdom, I'd be happy to pay for it. I would think 400 tons of silver ought to do it. And whatever questions King Xerxes had about Haman's plot, they went right out the window when the money was announced. After all, nobody could out-generous the king. "Keep your money," Xerxes said, "and do what you think is best." And King Xerxes reached for another piece of meat while his kingdom stood with dropped jaws at the decree that just went out from the citadel, a decree issued in the king's authority but executed by Haman, carried to every corner of every province to annihilate the Jews, man, woman, and child. And King Xerxes never even asked who this people was that Haman wanted to exterminate. Esther's world, living in the palace, was so sheltered from the day-to-day life of the citadel that she didn't even hear about the decree. It wasn't until her cousin Mordecai camped out in the king's gate wearing nothing but sackcloth and ashes that she learned of the impending destruction of her people. Messengers carried the correspondence between the dirt and the grime of the street and the silk-lined hallways of the queen. Mordecai, begging her, "Go to the king. Reveal to him that you're a Jew and beg for mercy for your people." Esther understood that there was only one mistake she could make that would cost her her comfortable life. Vashti's mistake. Too bold. Too strong. Her answer came back to Mordecai. Everyone knows that for any man or woman in the kingdom who approaches the king without being summoned, he has but one law, that he be put to death. The only exception is if he extends his gold scepter to spare his life. But it's been 30 days since I was summoned to the king. And you can almost hear Esther's prayer written between the lines. "Not me, Lord. Save your people. Not through me." Maybe you've even prayed that prayer. "Not me, Lord. Save her. Turn his life around. Not through me." Mordecai's answer came directly. "If you remain silent at this time, relief for the Jews will arise from some other place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this." Such a time as this. And so 3 days of fasting later, Esther stood beneath that majestic stone archway, her face composed into an expression serene on the outside, though on the inside her heart was beating away in anxious rhythm. Will I live? Will I die? Will I live? Will I die? As her eyes watched the gold scepter in her husband's hand and then tried to read the expression on his face so far away across that room, the moment stretched and stretched and stretched until at last, at long last, she saw the corner of his mouth begin to twitch, the beginning of a smile. And King Xerxes reached out his gold scepter in an invitation for her to come, to speak, to live. And Esther made her request. I have prepared a banquet. If it pleases the king, let him come and enjoy my food and my drink. And bring Haman. And King Xerxes couldn't resist his beautiful wife, so different from Queen Vashti. Immediately he sent for Haman. Immediately he went to the banquet and he sat. And they ate and they drank, and he watched as his wife sat there demurely as he enjoyed the food. And it wasn't until the wine was poured and the goblet twisted between his fingertips but the king asked for her real request. What is your petition? Even up to half my kingdom, name it and it's yours. If any man understood the king, it was Haman. But if any woman understood the king better than Haman, it was Esther. If it pleases the king, let him return tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare, along with Haman. And then I will make my request. No bed could have been soft enough for Esther to sleep that night. As the sun rose the next morning, her eyes were already wide open, and as each of those golden rays peeked through her window, she watched as the trappings of her position came into view, the rich tapestries along the walls, the silk sheets along her bed, the carefully woven, intricately woven clothing in her wardrobe, the servants who came in the moment that she called them, the trappings of her position. Mordecai had said, who knows but that you have come to royal position for such a time as this. How had an orphan, an exile, ended up in her position? Could it have been luck or a reward for her hard work and her righteous life? Or was it given her? Given her. Every luxury in the world given her for a purpose, for such a time as this. When the time came, Esther was ready. The food was prepared, the meal delicious, the wine poured, and the queen a sight to behold in her beauty. Xerxes arrived with Haman, and they ate and they drank. And again, it wasn't until the wine goblet dangled from his fingertips and his eyes lingered on hers that he asked for her request. And he watched as the sweet smile on his wife's face melted away into tears forming on her cheeks. Grant my life. This is my petition. Save my people. This is my request. For my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter. Anger flared in King Xerxes' eyes as he demanded, who is he? Who dared to do such a thing? Esther turned toward Haman. And at last the king understood. In a rage, he pushed his way back from the table and he marched out of the room, too furious to speak, too furious to react, too furious even to think. When he returned a few moments later, he didn't have to think. For there was Haman, intending to plead for his life from the queen, now bent over the couch where she reclined, his face inches from hers, too close, and caught in that compromising position in full view of the king. Haman's life was ended. God's people, the Jews, God's people even in exile, were saved. The next time you find yourself reading between the lines of your life, and you recognize that subtle prayer beneath the surface, not me, Lord, not through me, Remember Esther. Remember not just Esther, but remember the one who brought her to her position. The one who gave her the beauty and the wisdom far beyond her years, who provided her with a cousin who would hold her to account and who would pour courage into her in the moment when she needed it most. Remember him, the one written not just between the lines of this story, but writing all the lines of history. He who prayed his own reluctant prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane. And yet, not my will, but yours be done. Remember that he loves the ones you care about even more than you do. He died for them as he died for you. And remember that as surely as he brought Esther to her position for a purpose, he has done the same with you, making you who you are, placing you where you are, for just such a time as this. Amen.